Welcome to the Merrily End. My name is Mark Machado, and I'm joined, as always, by our regular panel of Estelle Vasudevan in Colombo, Nick Brookes on the south side of London, and Dominic Machado in not New York. I was going to say New York in the USA. Not too far from New York though. We are having our weekly romp through Sri Lankan cricket. It's a bit difficult for us at the moment because obviously Sri Lanka is currently suspended by the ICC. We'll get into that. We'll also talk, give you our thoughts on Australia. We'll talk a little bit about Aravinda De Silva being inducted into the Hall of Fame. If you haven't found us before, we produce regular Sri Lankan cricket content in English. We've got a newsletter as well. You can subscribe to that. Please subscribe because we love you to be part of this. I'm going to use that cringe word, journey back to full membership of the ICC. Guys, we've got to start with that. Sri Lanka is still suspended. Estelle, can you tell us what the latest is and what the feeling is in Sri Lanka at the moment?
There hasn't been that much progress since the last time we spoke, I think. The only major piece of news is that SLC, I think, is filing a case for defamation against the sports minister. And there have been multiple press releases from Sri Lanka Cricket alleging that there's a lot of malicious content and stories being spread about them by the sports minister and members of the parliament and so on. Obviously, this has been a hot topic in the parliament of Sri Lanka. I mean, it's not like there are more important things for them to discuss there. But one other thing was that the leader of the opposition, Sajith Premadasa, released some of the letters that SLC allegedly sent to the ICC detailing the interference by the government and their inability to run the SLC autonomously. So, so that's kind of the latest. Tomorrow, 21st, is supposed to be the final day for the ICC board meeting. So I think we should know the details of what this suspension means by the end of the day tomorrow.
I wonder if it will be after the England game, after the England victory, where we all got really excited and came on and recorded an emergency podcast full of hubris that we were going to win the tournament. I mean, I can't see any statement from the ICC unless they've somehow managed to find the way that India have actually won the World Cup would trigger the fourth us to do an emergency podcast. But there we go. Dom, how are you feeling currently about the suspension? Because I think this is a tragic time for a lot of us Sri Lankan cricket fans.
Yeah, I think it's a really sad time, especially after a not so blockbuster World Cup. But I've been thinking a lot about something we talked about last week, how all cricket and politics are interlinked in South Asian countries. So the whole Arjuna going and saying Jai Shah is the reason why Sri Lankan cricket is ruined, and then the Sri Lankan government calling Jai Shah and apologizing to him for that, right? It embodies just how entangled cricket and politics are, right? And how much sort of the outward facing facade of Sri Lanka to much of the world is their cricket prowess. So, and they know people care about it. So rather than dealing with real problems, right? The other big news coming from Sri Lanka is that Rajapaksa was convicted, right? Found guilty of being responsible for the economic problems in Sri Lanka, right? And but instead, our government ministers are calling Jai Shah and apologizing. Arjuna Ranatunga is running his mouth about these things. So it's sad that political interference continues to rule the day in Asian cricket, and that it's resulted for us in a suspension of activity when, sport should be a way for the people of Sri Lanka to enjoy something other than the difficult situations that they're dealing with. But now they've become intermingled and intermixed. And as Estelle said, this is what they're talking about in Parliament.
Nick, what's your state like? Because obviously you're kind of three teams, the West Indies, Sri Lanka and England, and all three aren't covering themselves in cricket and glory at the moment. Though, I mean, England are due to play the West Indies soon, so you're going to come out with a winner there, surely.
I mean, someone's got to win there, right? You'd hope. But yeah, kind of backing 3 teams. I thought I had my bases pretty well covered, and I have done for most of like my life. But at the moment, sadly, it's going wrong for all of them. I just hope this situation in Sri Lanka gets sorted out soon. Really selfishly, I was hoping to go to the semis and the finals of the Under-19 World Cup. And so it would be a real disaster for me if that's no longer in Sri Lanka. And I think I've said it before, I said it last week, I just think it's really disappointing if this issue prevents the Under-19s from playing in that tournament. You know, as kids, it's such a huge springboard. It's such a great opportunity. It's, I mean, we've seen how many players have moved really swiftly from the Sri Lanka Under-19s to the big side, having done well in that tournament. So, you know, yeah, it would be a real shame if this wrangling kind of impacts on Sri Lanka's Under-19s playing in that tournament.
Is that I thought the suggestion was last week was that we'd still be able to host that. Is there talk that it might be moved, or is this what this statement's about? Maybe that's what we're going to end up doing the emergency pod on.
I was under the impression that it still wasn't secure as long as Sri Lanka was suspended. I might be wrong, though. What do you guys know?
I just think logically, with only 2 months to go, it's unlikely that they will change the venue, particularly because it's a number of teams, right? It's not like the Asia Cup where you have like 6 teams. So I don't think they'll move it, but I mean, I don't know if I'm being overly optimistic about it because you never know, right? But I think they might keep it here. But our participation is the thing that's in question, I think.
Yeah, I think there was also a pot of money associated that the ICC had earmarked for work on the stadiums and the grounds to prepare them. So I don't know how much of that is jeopardized as well, because it seemed like that might potentially be in jeopardy. So that's an opportunity lost to, you know, better the cricket facilities on the island to meet ICC standards. So that's another thing. And I agree that hopefully they don't move it again. It's, you know, with all the contractual things that have been signed, and finding a new host would probably be rather difficult. So I'd imagine it will stay in SL, but the participation of the Under-19s is something that is worrisome.
Let's hope there's a swift resolution, because we want to see Sri Lanka playing cricket at the highest level. And, you know, it's for me, it feels deeply unfair that issue with the senior men's side has spilled over to impact the youth teams and the women's sides and all the other teams that SLC have to. I say have to because I think it's fair to say they would rather not run some of those teams, but that they run, right. It's interesting. One of the things you said there, Dominic, is you talked about sport being entwined with politics. I just feel like it's easy to batter Sri Lanka or India or the other South Asian countries with that stick. But I just feel that happens in every country with every major sport. I think, you know, football is literally a political thing in the UK with, you know, almost whenever a new politician arises, they've got to at some point try and declare who they support. In other countries, football has been pivotal in regime change. And, you know, if you go, you know, Argentina got a right-wing president come in today. It's interesting that happened because, you know, Maradona was a very well-known socialist, right? And he's pretty much the most popular person in Argentina. And, you know, again, that's another example of where sport is entwined itself in politics, possibly the other way around. But I think it's slightly unfair to go, this is a Sri Lankan or South Asian issue. I think it happens everywhere, right, Nick?
Yeah, I think it does happen everywhere to an extent, and sport and politics are kind of inescapably intertwined. I think in South Asia it can often seem more kind of brazen or more just immediately obvious. I mean, you don't tend to get, you know, like football being discussed in Parliament in the UK, right, as openly as it is done in Sri Lanka. But I think that it's kind of like there's an authenticity about it. Like I remember being in church in Sri Lanka and hearing the priest praying for the cricket team. And there's like that sense that cricket really does pervade all areas of life in a genuine kind of authentic way. It's not like David Cameron kind of saying that he supports West Ham 1 minute and Aston Villa the next because they wear the same color jersey, right? So, I mean, I think it's fair that sport, or particularly cricket, means more to South Asia, I think, than sport does in lots of places. And so that's, I guess, why we see more sort of brazen political intrusions, I guess.
If you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube, firstly, hit the subscribe button. And secondly, if you're wondering why Nick was in a church, it'll be because until I assume quite recently, even to this day, churches in some parts of Colombo play the role of dating apps. And I'm sure that's where he was, no doubt, looking for a good wife or good husband. I don't know, whatever floats his boat, right? We're equal opportunities broadcaster here. Guys, we talk about the Cricket World Cup. Australia ruined the party, as it were. Well, I only say that because I think it was all set up. It was meant to be Narendra Modi's. That's another example of politics in sport. His big moment to hand over the World Cup trophy to Virat Kohli. Virat was going to be named player of the tournament. India were going to be the champions. Not Virat Kohli, Rohit Sharma. Sorry, Virat would have been player of the tournament, and we'd have all gone home and talked about the 2023 World Cup and the day India rose to dominance. Except nobody had told the Australians, and they flipped the script, as it were. Estelle, we'll go to you first because you're proudly wearing your Australian hat.
Yeah, it was an incredible performance, I felt, because, I mean, I know a lot of people would disagree with me, but I think Sri Lanka thought the same, like Sri Lankan management also thought the same thing. But your best chance of beating India is probably putting them to bat and trying to restrict them to that score of 240, 250. And then the toughest part, I think, is to get past those first 10 to 15 overs where the ball is moving and India always on the money, right? And if you can do that, then you can chase that 240 to 250. And that's exactly what Australia did yesterday. Everyone was calling it a brave decision to bowl first. And I suppose it is because, we've at least I think our generation has grown up with put runs on the board, put the team chasing under pressure. That's the kind of mentality we've grown up with. But obviously they had read the conditions really well. Everything that needed to go right went right for Australia yesterday. And I was listening to another podcast we were talking about catch efficiency for Sri Lanka earlier in the tournament, right? Australia's catch efficiency in the lockouts was 100%. So no dropped catches, no missed opportunities. And besides that, I think 20 plus runs saved in the field. So I think that's equivalent of, having an extra player, right? Extra batter in there to get you 30 runs on the board. So everything that could go right went right for them. I don't think India played badly. I just think that Australia outplayed them. And we talk about, sometimes when we talk about, championship mentality, it might sound a bit, like psychobabble. And you're looking back in hindsight, of course, it looks like that. But when you look at Australia, it's hard to argue that point, right? That there is definitely a mental component to it because I don't think they even look like the second best team in this tournament. They looked scratchy all along. They struggled against us early. We were 125 for no loss. And I would say a large part of them coming back into that game was Sri Lanka's own bad performances. Similarly, against Afghanistan, they were 90 for 7, right? Chasing to 290, I believe. And Maxwell got them over the line. So that it's not just when we talk about big match mentality, it's not just the knockout games, but even in those situations, in those tough situations, someone is able to pull something out of the hat. Like against Sri Lanka, I really believe David Warner's catch, if I think it was Pathum Nissanka in the deep, where he covered a huge amount of ground. He's 37 years old, oldest in the squad, if I'm not mistaken. He covers that amount of ground. He takes that catch after Australia had been one of the worst fielding sides in the first 2 games. And that completely, I think, it changes the momentum, it changes that belief in the team. Similarly, Maxwell's knock, right? How do you not believe that things are meant to be for you after that happens, right? Because nobody would have given them a chance in that situation. I don't know even if Stark, who was coming in next, was thinking, or not Stark, I think it was Hazelwood next, would have believed that they're going to get over the line without him having to come out to bat. So yeah, everything went right for Australia. I think India still the best team in the tournament. They were nearly flawless for 10 games, and then just the other team had a better day on the final.
Nick, this is a podcast where we discuss Sri Lankan cricket. So the question is, how far away are Sri Lanka from that Australia side, and how far away are we, on the assumption that we regain our full member status for the ICC, from competing with at the top end of those tournaments?
It's a tricky question to answer, Marky, but I think what's really interesting about Australia that Estelle kind of touched on is that they were a long way from perfect, this team, right? They kind of went in and people were saying, do they have a clear game plan? You know, I don't think anyone knew who was going to be in their first 11, really. Like Labuschagne, who wasn't initially slated to be in the squad, ended up being kind of like a crucial member of that batting lineup. Stoinis and Cam Green, who I think we probably all foresaw playing a bigger role, were kind of incidental really throughout the latter stages of the tournament. Got to give a massive shout out to Travis Head, who I think is, you know, a guy who came in and made a huge difference. If you look at the semi, the start that Australia got off to, I feel, was kind of like what got them over the line. And then he plays a huge innings in the final, having done the same to India in the World Test Championship final in London earlier in the year. So like, what an amazing year he has had. And but yeah, I think, you know, you look at Australia's mentality, and like when the chips are down, someone turns up. It might be Travis Head, it might be Glenn Maxwell, it could be Paddy Cummins, who had an amazing day with the ball yesterday, having, you know, I think he openly admitted that he wasn't quite sure what his role was in ODI cricket. So it feels like there's always someone who stands up for Australia, and Sri Lanka at the moment seem kind of the opposite. Like when the going gets tough, they fold, right? They don't get going at all. And I think we saw that a few times throughout the tournament. And I don't know exactly what it is, but I felt like Sri Lanka, especially in the latter stages of this World Cup group stage, were really lacking in confidence. And that's the thing I think which needs to change most. I mean, we were talking about off air, I was saying how Kusal Mendes has such a high ceiling, I think higher than many batters in international cricket, but you don't see it that often. And I mean, we've railed about consistency with Sri Lankan players a lot over the past few years. And, you know, so much of the game is mental. I think that there are so many talented cricketers in Sri Lanka, but channeling that talent, getting it to a place where you can perform consistently on a regular basis seems to be that missing ingredient at the moment. I hope that's something that can be developed in the next couple of years.
Dom, how do we get that mentality right? Because it feels to me like I felt that Australia team was experience plus mentality got them that trophy, right? Because it was the kind of the old men of Australian cricket in many places, not quite all of them, but a lot of them have been around quite a while. And then they've got that kind of, you know, the championship mentality, whatever you want to call it. Because it seems to me that's the biggest difference between Sri Lanka teams that were getting to finals and winning finals, and Sri Lanka teams that are struggling to qualify for ICC tournaments. How do we flip that round again? How do we get that back? Is that something only players can do?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And I think it is a bit unfair to say that we totally lack that mentality. I think we've seen some of it, right? The Asia Cup, the last two Asia Cups, we've seen positive mentality, winning the moment mentality. I think, you know, in 2022, we saw a side that was willing to give their all when it came to fielding. A side that, yes, there were, you know, stars, but no one was, you know, you didn't have someone like Virat Kohli who was just scoring runs throughout the entire tournament. You had different people chipping in at different stages when they needed to, right? Hasaranga coming to the party in that Pakistan final, right? Monica Rajapaksa rising to the occasion there. Asita Fernando coming in, right, and scoring runs. So we saw that mentality there. I think we saw it in parts in the Asia Cup final, in the Asia Cup 2023, right? The matches against Pakistan, the matches against Bangladesh, which were hard-fought matches where they had to kind of grind it out till the end, take it down to the last over and win those moments. So we've seen them do it, but we've seen them do it in kind of this smaller scale, right? In the Asia Cup, right, they're playing against teams that they play the most, that they feel comfortable against. And that kind of gets to your experience point, Mark. They've been there before. They feel like they can do it. But I think to make it at the World Cup stage, and this is we've seen in T20 World Cups, right? Those winning moments, we've missed out on them again in that game against South Africa, in the game against England. So maybe part of that is not just being comfortable playing in your own backyard, playing in conditions where you're comfortable, winning the way that you want to win, but creating that winning mentality away from home, figuring out what do we need to do? How do we dig deep when we're playing in conditions that don't suit us, right? And you look at Australia, right? Their top five, okay, you go Warner, right? So many people are writing him off as past his prime, right? Head was injured for the first part of the tournament. Mitch Marsh has been coming into form, but he struggled with form off and on for years. Smith and Labuschagne are odd fits for what one-day cricket is, right? Compared to who's batting at 4 and 5 for other teams. Maxwell, you obviously have a world beater, but he was out of form and had a completely broken leg, right? You know, less than a year ago. So this was a side that had all sorts of question marks. They're not India where you look up and down their lineup and you think, oh my gosh, every player is perfectly suited for this. They're not even South Africa where you look at their lineup and most of their players are suited for this. But mentality, the idea that everyone pitches in, the idea that when the going gets tough, we figure out a way to do it and we grind it out. That's there. I think it's coming, right? The players are slowly building confidence. We're seeing better and better performances. I think one thing that I've had in mind too is that mental fatigue that Mahela talked about, the physical and mental fatigue. How do we get players on the park who are in the best mental and physical shape, right? Because that's fielding, right? Like Estelle talked about, and it's that winning mentality. How do we get them into and cultivate a winning mentality? So I think that's got to be priority number one. We know the talent is there. We know this is a team that on its best days can play anyone, right? Remember, they beat this Australian side without Wainindu Hasaranga. I know no Zampa and no Stark for the Australians, but we didn't have Dilshan Madhushanka. We didn't have as penetrative as a new ball bowling side. We took India before this match. I think how many had India won in a row? Probably 14, 15 matches in a row if you include the Asia Cup and the World Cup. The closest they'd come to losing was that game in Colombo where Junith Walalage, we put them into bat first. Walalage took 6 wickets or 5 wickets, I forget. And then we almost brought it down at the end. So we have talent to play with anyone in the world. It's about cultivating a winning mentality and doing those things to stay mentally and physically fit.
I think that, kind of bringing it back around to suspension, I think that's the kind of sad part of all of this is that if our boys and girls, everyone involved in cricket end up losing playing time, fixtures aren't fulfilled, if they can't get fixtures, then it'll just be such a shame that it's come down to a political argument, right? And that's why I think we all want just a swift resolution of this and to kind of get on and move on to the next step of this team's evolution, because I feel much like you, Dom, I think there's a core of players there that could go on and do something special if they're nurtured in the right way and given the right opportunities. And I think the last week or 10 days in Sri Lankan cricket has been a great example of this. There is pressure on that team, like there is almost the only other place in the world that is like that is India and Pakistan, right? I don't think in Bangladesh they have the expectations on the sides that we seem to have as Sri Lanka fans. I think maybe once upon a time that expectation might have been there in the West Indies sides. I don't think it's there anymore. We've basically created a kind of melodrama because this team didn't win the World Cup or get to a position which we thought was acceptable as a kind of top four side or whatever. And it's really important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because undoubtedly some things do need to change and some players need to possibly be moved on or whatever. But at the moment, none of that's possible. Guys, should we move on and talk about the ICC Hall of Fame? Because that was a positive for Sri Lanka last week. Aravinda De Silva was inducted into the Hall of Fame. I think he became the fourth Sri Lankan into the Hall of Fame. Nick, you wrote a great piece about his exploits in the newsletter that's just gone.
Oh, yeah, I loved writing it, Marky. I never get tired of writing about Aravinda, who has to be like one of the more romantic, evocative, mythical, insert whatever adjective you want, cricketers in the history of the game, right? I think he really captures the imagination. There's something to me that has always felt like very emblematic of Sri Lanka about him, a kind of like 5'3" guy who often would come onto the cricket pitch looking a bit maybe like dopey or docile, like he's just woken up from a half an hour afternoon nap. But then, I mean, he's absolutely explosive with the bat, isn't he? Just totally box office. There are two shots which I always associate with him. One is the like hook right off the bridge of his nose, and the other is when he just charges down at fast bowlers and kind of whips them through straight mid wicket. I think he well deserved his promotion into the Hall of Fame, as I touched on in the piece that I wrote. His I think the runs that he scored during the early years of his career didn't reflect quite how good a player he was. And he averages 42, I think, in Test cricket, which is probably towards the lower end of the spectrum for players in the ICC Hall of Fame. And I think that based on the talent that he had, he probably should have averaged 55, as he kind of did during the latter stage of his career. But what a player. And he could bowl a bit too. I mean, I was just rewatching the 96 World Cup final, and those deliveries, especially the ones that he got, who was it, Ponting and Healy with, a couple of cracking flighted off breaks. And one of my favorite interviewees, Mr. Pushpak Umara, described Aravinda as the second best off spinner in Sri Lanka during the 90s. I don't know if there was a bit of hyperbole there, but yeah, what a wonderful cricketer. He seems like a lovely, softly spoken man, and absolutely chuffed to see him in the ICC Hall of Fame.
There's been a lot of talk online this last few days, because obviously the last time Australia lost to a nation side in the World Cup final was against Sri Lanka in 1996. Firstly, I think cricket should have stopped there. After that World Cup, everything since has been slightly tragic, apart from a couple of highlights around 2014. But the thing I was going to say about it, when you look at the numbers, it's interesting what you talked about is Aravinda's his averages, because by the time the 96 World Cup final had happened, he'd been playing international cricket for 12 years. We were blooding them young back then and keeping them in the side for a long time. They had to learn on the game. Do you think, Estelle, there's been a kind of cultural shift where Sri Lankans don't accept losing as much as they once did? And actually, we've got to accept that if we're going to build a team, we've got to let the future Aravindas go out and make mistakes.
It also comes down to how many people are watching right now, right? With social media and broadcast. And I was just thinking, and I don't know whether this is, I don't know the reason, but I genuinely, it's because I'm really young. I can't remember much of Aravinda's batting, apart from like maybe 2003 is my most my strongest memory of him at that World Cup. And that is possibly because TV, I mean, how many of those games were telecast live in Sri Lanka on channels available all over the island, right? So that is also something to consider. Also, I think when Sri Lanka had that real like golden age, right, from probably around 2000, I don't know if we can give 2003 also, keep that as part of it, but from that 2004 5 to 14, that golden age, it it kind of set us up to expect Sri Lanka to do well in every tournament, right? Whereas realistically in this tournament, if you look at 2023, it would have taken a miracle for Sri Lanka to get into the top 4, because we did come in after playing qualifiers. Sure, we looked definitely a level above the teams that played in the qualifiers in Zimbabwe. But once we faced tougher opposition, we did look like we were kind of always trying to make up ground against them, right? Where we needed to have a perfect game and they needed to kind of have almost a below par game for us to beat them. But that golden era kind of set us up to expect Sri Lanka to always be consistently up there among the top 4, among the top 5. Maybe we don't do well between World Cups, but at the tournament itself, we'd be, on the top of our game. And that just hasn't happened. But you're right about, failure. I think we kind of touched on this in the last episode as well, about the patience or the lack of patience that there is in Sri Lanka, where you don't really have time to build and become a good team, because everyone wants quick results, right? I mean, you hire a coach, you want to go from playing the qualifiers for the World Cup to getting into the final of the World Cup in 2 years, which in today's day and age, it doesn't work, because teams are all professional, right? You can't depend on talent alone, which is another difference I see in like Aravinda's era, where talent is distributed almost equally, I would say, across the globe. But it's everything beyond that needs to fall in place to really, put you up there, right? And if I just bring in the example of Australia, like their culture is so centered around sport that Sri Lanka and Australia have similar populations, but it's so centered around sport that they're able to kind of they have built their systems in such a way that there aren't big changes to be made when there is failure, right? Like, I mean, if you look at 2019, where they were knocked out in the semifinals, sure, semifinals is not a failure, but to a country that's consistently winning World Cups, it probably felt like they didn't do enough, right? From there, they didn't have to change a lot to become world champions. Whereas for Sri Lanka, if we are to be successful, there has to be an overhaul, which never seems to be coming, because if Dom starts the overhaul now, as soon as he loses his position 2 years later, someone else scraps that and tries something else. So there's never any real progress, which is unfortunate, but that's like kind of how it goes here, right? I still think that all the success we saw in those years with Sangama, Hela, Dilshan, that was in spite of the system. It wasn't because of the system. It was just these guys really consistently punching above their weight.
I think we've said it before in this. It's Sri Lanka's strength is the youth system. I think the school system, from what I can see, and admittedly I'm not a parent or child or whatever. I've never been one in Sri Lanka, so I'm not on the ground there. But what I can see is that school system's really strong. It's not perfect, but it's a foundation which creates all the talent, or a lot of talent, not necessarily all of it. And I think one of the things SLC have got to do in the future is look for other ways to bring people through who might have fallen out of that school system at some point. But I think that system is still doing a lot of heavy lifting, right? And it's getting Shrug to a place where we can consistently qualify for tournaments. We just need to figure out that top 10% to be able to do something with it. Dom, I was going to go back to the Aravinda chat and say we've got 4 Sri Lankan players in the Hall of Fame. Who's going to be the next one?
Ooh, this is a great question. Angelo Matthews, no, not actually Angelo Matthews. But I think
his place in cricket history is assured. Don't worry, Dom.
Yeah. No, I think there are three players who I think are richly deserving, and I hope get a call. So this is a plug, ICC, MCC, if you're listening, absolutely give a look to their resumes. I mean, when we think of Aravinda and revolutionizing one-day cricket in 1996, we also have to think of Sanath. When you look at how many games he played, how many hundreds he scored, how many wickets he took in the one-day game, it's a shock to me when people create their all-time ODI 11s and they'll quickly write down Sachin and Gilchrist. And I'm like, hold on. Those two teams, India and Australia, the batsman they feared most in the world was Sanath. He destroyed them to all parts of the ground. And, he has 300 ODI wickets. That is ridiculous, right? And he would bowl the death overs for Sri Lanka. He would bowl the last over. He defended 6 a couple of times. So iconic as a player, so iconic as a batter. And his impact on Sri Lankan cricket remains large. You look at so many of these players. You look at Kusal Pereira. You look at Charatha Salanka. You look at Chamari. They all look like mini Sanaths when they're out there batting, right? It's an amazing thing to watch. I wonder how much of the sort of personal drama might get in the way of his induction, but in terms of Sanath as a player, there's no doubt that he should be in the Hall of Fame. And he wasn't as great of a test player as he was a one-day player, but he was still a very, very good test opener, average of 40, 1400s, everything you could ask for. I think the other two that I would include are bowlers. So Chaminda Vas, again, speaking of ODI greats, for my money, after Wasim, the best left arm one-day bowler in history. So good. Maybe Mitchell Stark has some questions about that, but
Estelle, you're a traitor.
No, I love Vas, but
very displeased.
Yeah. But he was so good, so consistent for so long. Sri Lanka's first truly great fast bowler, should be looking for induction. And then sort of if these are the stars of that sort of early portion of the golden era, 2 stars from the later portion should get noticed. So I think Lasith Malinga, I mean, again, global superstar, an action that is actually more imitable than we previously thought. But what a player. So many magical moments, taking 4 and 4 at a World Cup, multiple hat tricks. That delivery, the swagger that he brought to Sri Lankan cricket was amazing. And then somebody who, is often overlooked when we talk about the great players in Sri Lankan history, Rangana Herath, as a test bowler, a total, again, we talked about Aravinda being diminutive. Rangana was diminutive too, carried that, that quintessential Sri Lankan belly with him when he played, but a mountain of the man when he bowled at home, the way that he could just, if you were facing him at Gaul in the 4th innings, no shot. Even India could not defeat Herath in the 4th inning. So those are my sort of next in line. Who will get it? I'd imagine it would be either Sanath or Malinga would be first in line, but those are the 4 that I kind of see as being Hall of Famers in the future.
I'm just going to throw one more name in there. I mean, I think she's still got plenty of cricket left in her, and I assume you can't enter until you retire. But I think Chamari's place is all but assured, right? I've been waking up at really odd times in the morning to watch the WBBL, which isn't even on TV in England. I mean, when you think of Sri Lankans going to Australia, you think of, or at least I think of, streams of Aussie politicians coming on Australian TV channels saying they don't want us and that we're boat people or whatever it is. Mm. And now, like Chamari, and I know she's had a few goes at the WBBL, but she's, we're in Chamari prime here, right? She's absolutely tearing it apart. They're naming a bit of the stand after, and I know it's a bit of a marketing thing to get fans in, but I really hope the Sri Lankans in Sydney kind of can really embrace that and spare an afternoon or whatever time it is to go and support the Thunder, because I think, I mean, you can Nick's written extensively obviously about Sri Lankan, the men's side, and there's just hundreds of men who've been instrumental in getting Sri Lankan cricket to where it is. But Chamari's basically like a tortoise, right? She's got the whole of women's cricket on her back from that island, and she's got to carry it through. And I think she's like paving the way, and she's become so good now that teams want to play us. I woke up this morning to the news that she's got a franchise deal in New Zealand. And I imagine hopefully the next kind of 12 to 18 months, she'll be able to really capitalise on it and beyond, and make an absolute fortune. And hopefully it's proved out to people in Sri Lanka and the people with the money that being a woman who can play cricket is a very viable option, something they should all get behind, and it can bring glory to this to the island once again. I was going to give the full title, but I couldn't remember if it's a Socialist Democratic Republic still or not. Yeah, has anyone else been watching Chamari's innings? Because I can't get enough. She's just the cleanest hit for the ball we've got. It's amazing.
Yes, she's destroying those bowling attacks, isn't she? Like, I've watched a couple of games where, it's not even just the domestic Australian bowlers, right? You've got players like Alana King who just can't bowl to her. It's also helping that I think some of those grounds, the boundaries are really short, and she's able to comfortably clear all those boundaries. It's with Chamari, it's so obviously a mental thing, right? As soon as she's able to get those runs under her belt, there's no stopping her. And I saw a stat today. She has the best economy in the team at 6.55. So also has contributed massively with the ball. And it's strange because Chamari really believes in herself, but it seems like Heather Knight believes in her even more, because she seems to be giving her like the new ball, then letting her bowl in the death. And she's thriving under, those conditions. It's great to see. I was just thinking about the Hall of Fame. Obviously, I was thinking about Chamari as well. Is it only stats? I do think there's a component where they look at impact, and that's where someone like Aravinda is coming in, because as Nick mentioned, like if you look at the Hall of Famers, 42 is kind of at the lower end of the type of players who they pick, but it's also influence, I think, and in that sense, guys like Lasith Malinga, Sanath Jayasuriya, Chamari, Athapaththu really can't be overlooked, right? The impact they've had not only on Sri Lanka but around the world, right? I mean, you still, if you post something about 96, or if you talk about Sri Lanka in the past, you'll have 10 Indians commenting about how scared they were when Sri Lanka played India in the 90s and early 2000s, because Sanath was so dominant, and even his test record, although it's not a great record, right? For the role he played, that's pretty good record, right? You're not looking at a guy who's looking to bat 3 sessions and score 90 runs, right? You're looking at a guy who's trying to change the game on its head in 2 sessions. And he managed to do that in so many games. I remember in 2002 or 4, when Australia came to Sri Lanka, they beat us 3-0, but Sanath played one of the great knocks I've seen personally. I think he got 150. He and Vas put on a really big partnership. We were chasing a big total. Australia didn't know. I mean, Shane Warne wasn't sure what he needs to do, because Sanath was just clearing the boundary with every shot on the leg side. So in terms of, if you're looking at stats plus impact, then you have to think that, particularly for someone like Sanath, the call is not far away.
What about Aravinda De Silva? How far away do you think? Arjuna Ranatunga. How far away do you think he is from the Hall
now
of
that
Fame
he's bashed Jay Shah, he's very far away.
I was going to come in with the Arjuna shout. I would love to see him inducted into the Hall of Fame. I think it's probably slightly too cerebral a pick, even if he hadn't gone around slagging everyone off like every 2 minutes. But I mean, you know, if you look at the impact that he had on Sri Lankan cricket, and I really do believe that it was his influence as captain which completely changed the fortunes of the team during the first part of the 1990s. I also, I said this in my book, and I'll back it till the day I die, that I think Michael Bevan is miscredited with being cricket's first finisher, and I think Arjuna was the first finisher in ODIs. And I mean, he was a really talented batsman. People forget how good he was because he only scored 4 Test hundreds. I mean, he should have had masses more than that. I remember reading in Sobers' book that when he first came to Sri Lanka and saw Arjuna as a schoolboy, he was kind of blown away. He was a pretty beautiful little left-handed player. And I mean, he scored lots of 80s and 90s, but I think he should have scored a lot more Test runs. But in terms of captains, I mean, he's got to sit right up there with, you know, your Brearleys and whoever else right at that top table of international cricket captains. So I would love to see him in the ICC Hall of Fame. I also think that he kind of overturned a bit of a trend of the Asian sides getting bullied, and that, like, you know, what you've seen in captains like Ganguly and Kohli is a little bit indebted to Arjuna. I don't know if that's sort of a controversial stance, but yeah, I would love to see him in the ICC Hall of Fame. I'm sad that I don't think it's going to happen.
Could you imagine the speech that he would
He'd probably boycott the speech.
Yeah, or it would last for like 4 hours.
Yeah.
I always see Arjuna as Sri Lanka's Bielsa and Mahela as Sri Lanka's Pep Guardiola. That's a bit of a niche footballing reference, I know, but Sri Lanka, I suppose, is a bit of a niche cricket country. Gosh, I love talking about the past players. It just fills your heart, doesn't it? It's so true, isn't it? Every cricket fan in the world has a favourite Sri Lankan player. And I still think, you know, kind of, we're not really having a debate, but, you know, going back to Malinga, I think he's the one player that actually weirdly has changed cricket more than any of the other players we talked about, because he's the player when you're walking around watching kids play cricket, they're still all these years later, and he hasn't played in, what, 4 or 5 years, still trying to emulate his action. And now you've got, you know, me and Nick we were on an Iron Cricket podcast, and I was talking, and there was kind of saying that Malinga's your seamer, and I was like, actually, Sri Lankan cricket's changed a bit. We have seamers and we have slingers, and it's, you know, we're gonna hopefully could be in a position in a few years' time where there's a whole crop of slingers coming in for that slinger berth if you need to get it. And I mean, that's an innovation in cricket that kind of hasn't happened in about 60, 70 years, right? You have to go away and read some proper cricket history books to find out when the last time somebody basically reinvented a form of bowling is. And now actually we're almost at the point where we kind of just, you know, there's a group that youngsters coming through and watching the game now. Slinging has always existed. It's not a new thing for them. It's not something that looks a bit weird, and that impact, I think, is quite incredible. So hopefully in the next few years we'll see a few more Sri Lankan players come through and get into that Hall of Fame, right?
Yeah.
Guys, should we leave it there for today? We've nattered on a lot. We've kind of solved all of Sri Lankan cricket's woes. If you're from the Sports Ministry, if you're from the SLC, I think all of us would be available to come in and give you guys a good talking to if you need it. Hopefully by the time we're back next week, we will be not suspended we'll be full members again in the ICC, and I think there is some plans afoot to do a deeper dive into Aravinda's career at some point in the next few days if we can find time to make it all happen. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget the newsletter or the links in the description. Thanks a lot. Bye.